Hello, and welcome to another bonus episode of STEM Squared, an educational podcast that explores the cosmos of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics within the context of teaching and learning. And in today's episode, we have some big news. NASA has launched the Artemis 1 rocket today, and today is November 16, 2022. And over the course of the next 3 weeks, this rocket will be exploring and traveling around the moon and back to Earth. And so we wanted to create this podcast to complete our earlier discussion on STEM squaring the moon that you can catch in the last podcast, and also to explore what's going on in terms of the next few weeks of this extraordinary engineering feat and the rocket known as Artemis 1. But before we begin that, let's explore the news. The most important news this week in the Artemis 1 project is the launch of the spaceship itself. Now, the Artemis 1 has the Orion capsule, which has separated off and is currently, as of recording this podcast, streaking towards the moon. And for those students and teachers interested in following the journey of the Artemis 1 and Orion capsules, NASA actually has a tracker which can be linked in the description for this podcast. The spacecraft will actually be traveling for the next several weeks, and so for teachers and students interested in learning more about this spacecraft, you can find all sorts of resources both in the NASA and Canadian websites as they report on the updates for this journey. In addition to following the Orion space capsule as it goes around the moon and returns to Earth, within multicultural contexts, it's important to realize that the 21 nations that have signed on to the Artemis Accords are also deeply involved in other engineering aspects of the Artemis 1 and 2 projects. Most importantly, for our friends and colleagues here in Canada, the Canadian government is providing some of the same engineering componentry related to the development of space arms and Canada's first rover. The manned rover that NASA is building is also being tested in a lunar experimental landscape near Flagstaff, Arizona. And it is interesting to see how different nations are participating and involved within the engineering and technical aspects of both Artemis 1 and future Artemis launches. Let's return to the podcast. Welcome back to STEM Squared. In this section, we are going to go ahead and finish STEM squaring the moon as we talked about in our previous podcast. And so we talked about the societal connections between the moon and STEM, and we've also talked about students' conceptual knowledge as it relates to transforming their conceptions and common misconceptions about the moon. And it is interesting to think about the moon as an important force in the production of energy and how it orbits around the Earth. But here we want to talk about the E in STEM squared and the M in STEM squared. Now, E in STEM often revolves and connects to engineering. But in the context of STEM squared, we are talking about exceptional inclusion. And one of the best ways to include our exceptional learners is through hands-on design and STEM activities. And as an example, let's look at the Artemis 1 engineering as the vehicle itself. And so for students interested in exploring the Artemis 1 and its engineering complexity as a space vehicle, NASA has created a paper modeling project whereby students can construct their own Artemis 1 model. And having a physical hands-on model that students can manipulate is particularly important for our exceptional learners that see the world through their fingers. And the nice thing about the Artemis 1 vehicle compared to other historic vehicles like the shuttle program is we're returning back to the use of cylinders, which makes the construction of these models much easier within the context of paper-based activities. And so if you have students interested in a hands-on construction, check the story description for this podcast for that link to the Artemis 1 model. Now, the cool thing about this paper activity is that the Artemis 2 will have a lot of the same designs, and so students can actually construct the next version as well. In addition to the exceptional inclusion that we need to think about as teachers in STEM projects like activities related to the Artemis program, it's important to realize that the Artemis 1 project and the Artemis Accords have an invitation for multicultural inclusion as well. In our last podcast, we talked about the Canadian Space Agency and their participation in the Artemis 2 project, whereby one of the astronauts landing on the moon will be Canada's first astronaut. And it's interesting also to note that in the Artemis 2 project, some of the first women will be landing on the moon as well. But within a multicultural context, it is important to realize that more than 21 nations have signed on to the Artemis 1 program, including the European Space, nations of the European Space Agency, Japan, Mexico, and many other nations. And for teachers of culturally diverse students, it's an opportunity to explore NASA and space exploration within the context of the diversity of people involved in these projects. And so in this link, there are connections to the Artemis 1 Accords, and I would encourage teachers and students to explore not just the astronauts from the United States, but engineers, astronauts, and other experts on the Artemis 1 project that are involved from many other nations. The design and construction of the Artemis vehicles does include engineering and mechanical contributions from many other nations. As an example, the space arm and the Canadian rover that we talked about earlier in this episode. And we know that Japan is providing some of the important electronical engineering components as well. It's important also to realize that space exploration is something that goes beyond the member nations that signed on to the Artemis Accords. And so we have other countries currently exploring lunar projects as well, most notably China. And so China is in the process of designing and developing a lunar project as well. So, as we begin to wind down our podcast today on the Artemis 1 program and our exploration of the moon as an educational opportunity in STEM, it's important to realize that the design and creation of these fantastic lunar vehicles and rockets involve people from across the world with many different cultural perspectives on science and space exploration. Please feel free to update us on your teaching adventures as it relates to your lunar curriculum and the Artemis 1 activities that you can explore either on the NASA or Canadian websites or possibly another website from one of the other 21 participating nations. Again, let us know by sending us a quick email at stemsquared@gmail.com. And we are in the process of working on our next series, which explores the sun. We'll do that during the holiday season, and until then, we'll be monitoring the Artemis 1 program. So there may be another bonus episode as the program winds down, and we will see you in the next podcast.